Well, hello, folks. Here we are. It is Monday, the 4th of August. Hey now. And we are into our new scene. So, as you can see, I've got a couple of poses here worked out, and I'll just talk about them a little bit as I work. So, this next scene has got uh, my new character here drawn out. He's painting his lines out, and I'm having him sweep across and then sweep down. So what's going to happen is as he sweeps across this way, um, he's going to leave the part of the letter here, there, and then okay, and then in the last part of the action, he's bringing his hand down to finish off the action. Guess I could have him looking down at it there. Okay, pretty simple. Not a lot going on. Pretty simple. All right, so um, now what I wanted to mention here was that when you animate, everybody's going to have like different ways of doing things, and one of the methods that I learned as I was developing myself as an animator over the years was I developed this scribbling kind of technique where the drawings that I would do would be like stick figures, like what you're seeing here. And mainly because I realized that if I animated, that anybody can animate a stick figure. I think that was the basic thought I felt was that the tricky thing for me about animation, the thing that was eluding me, was that I couldn't understand how animators could be carrying all these details and be able to balance them. Like I would look at a milk call scene that was just beautiful. That you'd have these little head waggles and finger movements and little. And I just thought, like, how do you have all this in your head? I mean, you can kind of see a scene in your mind, but to be able to put it down on paper and have it look accurate or come to life, it's quite a deal. It's like if everybody could do that, we'd all be like Milcall. But Milcall was particularly good at this kind of thing. He was gifted. Okay, obviously he was gifted, but there was a sensibility behind what he was doing. And I've analyzed his work for years, though it has still eluded me even to this day. I've never done a scene that looked like something that Milcall did. I've always done things that I think work, on some level, but Milcall was like in another category as far as I would say. So, anyways, so I figured that if I could simplify a pose down to a scribble, then I could wrap my head around it. Then I could go, okay, I can animate a scribble because, for one thing, it doesn't take very long to draw a scribble. You can be very, very descriptive, very expressive with a stick figure. A lot more expressive in some ways than you can be with a full drawing. So that was the other side of that, was that I looked at it from that standpoint, that it was easier to um, control the scribble drawing than it was to draw just to do a full blown sketch. So that was the real reasoning behind why I worked that way. And and I don't do quite as much of that today. I tend to sort of jump right to a drawing, and I start, like I think you've seen in the other scenes that I've animated, that's what I was doing. That I went right to a more finished kind of drawing, and just went right to it. I didn't really do a lot of scribbling and then going over it. But I just wanted you to see that sometimes what I'll do in the beginning of working out what I want to do is I might scribble it because I can kind of get that to work quicker, you know. Um, the only drawback to scribbling for me is that, now you got to go back in and draw, you know. And I'm sort of the opinion that I kind of hate to have to waste time if I can avoid it. It's like if I can get right down to business of what I want to do and what I want to say with the drawing, that would be what I would choose to do. So a lot of times when I'm animating, I tend to go right to a drawing and I just say, well, let me make this key, let me make that key, because I understand how to connect the drawings. Um, Richard Williams was very good with this kind of thing where he would talk about, like Richard would, like if you have his, I don't know how many of you will, if you want to study somebody who's really good about analyzing, Richard Williams is really good at it. And his, um, what does he call it? Animator's survival kit. That's what he calls it. I have one. And it's great. It's great because what I like about the way that Richard talks about animation is that he's broken things down so that you can wrap your head around what it is you're doing. And he's taken the time to analyze certain types of actions so that you can mimic what he's doing. But I think the other beautiful thing about what Richard's done with his teaching is that he's shown you a way to look at animation practically. Like, he's not going to, you can't, I don't know that I'd say you could teach anybody everything you could learn and know about animation. I don't know if that's even possible, really. I don't think it is. But I think what you can do is you can give people principles, and this is what like for instance, the 12 principles of animation, that's really what that's about. Is it's really about um, breaking things down so that you can understand how stuff works, so that when you find yourself in a particular situation, you're animating a certain thing, you can approach it with confidence and you can approach it without fear, without worrying about like, how am I going to do that? I don't know how I'm going to, that then doesn't have to um, stop you, You can just keep going because you understand what it is you're doing. Like one of the things that Richard used to say about animation was he talked about walk cycles. And he used to say that the walk is one of the hardest things to do. And I can honestly say that when he said that, I used to think, really? I didn't think the walks were that hard to do because I figured, well, especially walk cycles. I thought, well, that's not too hard. It seems like to me that would be, it wouldn't be hard because I'd done it. And I'd done, at that point when he said that, I'd done a lot of walk cycles by that time. At the time I heard him say that, I don't remember exactly when it was. But the interesting thing was that what he did was he really broke down how you do it. And I realized when he started talking about it that I had been doing it wrong. I thought I was doing it right, but he broke it down and he talked about where the passing position was, and I realized, oh man, I wasn't doing it right. And I thought, oh my. And so once he said that and I started to analyze what he was saying, I realized, wow, he's really, really helping me because now I understand what I got wrong. Now I understand what I needed to do differently. And what it also did for me was it made me see that when you understand how things move or how to do certain things, it does give you a real heads up. It's like you're not guessing. Like, see, a part of me used to just think, okay, well, when you're animating, you're going to try to get everything to move fluidly, right? So that means you got to follow through on everything, and. So I used to think that, well, okay, that's the trick, right? You got to follow through everything. You got to make everything look really flowy and fluid, right? So you just add lots of in betweens, right? that'll do it. And I didn't understand that it's like, no, there's more to it than that. There's more to it than just adding a lot of in betweens and putting things on ones and all, because that's what I used to think. Because I would think that, okay, if something's on ones, then it's going to look great. And it just that's kind of true. But animation's not necessarily just a trick. I mean, good animation. If you're trying to do something where you're trying to bring life to a character, there's a lot more going on there. And boy, I learned that at Disney. I mean, Disney really. If I learned anything at Disney, I'll say the thing I learned the most was personality. That how you get in and out of a pose is just crucial. It's like what you do when you're in a pose and how you need to linger. There were just a lot of little things that I just thought like, wow, how do you know where to put this? How do you know where to put that? So when I started to scribble my stuff, that was the first time that I felt like I had some control over my animation because I was no longer intimidated by the drawing. I was no longer thinking like, okay, my drawing's got to be perfect, right, in order to get the animation to work. I realized, oh no, that's not it. It's not getting your animation perfect by how nice of a drawing you do it. It's where the drawings go. Richard has such an interesting way of describing things too. That's another thing I loved about him was that the way he broke things down in the way he would describe how to do something. It was fascinating to me. Like one of the things that he said, it was in a documentary he did. The first time I really heard a lot of this was in a documentary that he did back when I was working for him years ago. Richard used to have a studio here in Los Angeles and did commercials and stuff. And they had done, and I don't remember exactly what year this was when they did this, but they did a documentary of him when he was working on The Thief and The Cobbler, which was his own personal feature film that he had been working on for. I think at the time he had already been working on it for like I don't know 20 years or something like that, and which that just by itself was like fantastic to me that anybody had that kind of patience. But anyways, he would say animation. He says it's the skill. He would say, how did he put it? He said, it's how far apart the drawings are and it's how the drawings dovetail into one another. It's how far apart the drawings are and how you time it. And then he would say you pump personality into it. And yeah, well, how did he said it's not just doing one drawing after the other, because he said then anybody could do it. He said how one drawing dovetails into another, how far apart it is, and how you time it. That's the skill. And just that sentence said to me was profound because I'd never heard it put like that before. I thought, wow, what did he just say? And it occurred to me that it's like, yeah, he's right. And just that statement, for me anyway, I don't know if it would affect anybody else the same way it affected me, but it made me suddenly realize what I had been doing or what I had been trying to do and what I'd seen other artists and other animators do and why I was fascinated by when someone did it right. Another thing that Richard did in this documentary was he talked about how he became an animator. How Ken Harris, who was his lead animator, um, said something to him that changed his life as an animator. He said that he'd been working with Ken Harris for a long, long time, and Ken Harris was doing animation on The Thief, and so he was one of the lead animators on that. He and Art Babbitt, I guess, they were the two lead animators. They weren't the only animators on the film, but they were the two older, seasoned animators. Art Babbitt had worked for Disney, of course, and Ken Harris had worked at Warner Brothers. Anyways, they were talking, and I guess um, there was some animation or something that they were looking at on a moviola or something, and I guess Ken Harris said to Richard, he said, "Oh, he said that's really pretty good." He says you could almost be an animator, and Richard was deflated. He didn't. He basically told Ken. He says, "Oh, excuse me, I have to." And he stepped out and he sat on the porch. He was, he said he was like, "What?" And then he thought for a minute and he said, "Oh, you know what?" He said, "This is why I respect him so much, because he's the real thing." And so what happened was that he had this scene in The Thief that he wanted to do, and he used it, I guess, as a means to train himself to become an animator. And so he apparently worked on this scene. I think he said he worked on it for like a year or something like that. And he said after he had worked on it for like a year, and in fact, he said he even wrote the scene into his film just so he could use this scene he'd animated. And he said that he showed it to Ken after he felt like he'd gotten it kind of where he wanted it and everything. And then he said that Ken basically commented saying, "Okay, you're an animator." In other words, it's like he said it was like the conversation was picking up from the last time they talked. And so he had this scene that he'd done. That was the most fantastic thing I'd ever seen at that time. Still pretty fantastic even by today's standards. And it was a scene of the Grand Vizier character in The Thief, and he's talking, and he's got a deck of cards, and he spreads the cards out, and he stumbles with the cards at one point, and they all go flying in almost every direction, and he catches every one of them. And I'd never seen anything like that. I just like, oh my god, that was amazing. Beautiful animation. And he's talking too the whole time, and I just thought, wow. But what it said to me was that this thing we do when we're animating, um, there's a process of learning. There's a process of time where we have to wrap our heads around what it is we're doing to really, I guess, really do it correctly. And it isn't always the easiest thing to describe or tell people how we do what we do. Um, there's a lot to it. But I don't know. I was just particularly amazed, or I have been, or I had, of Richard Williams. I just always felt, I still to this day feel like Richard Williams could have very easily been one of the nine old men, in my opinion. I mean, I really feel strongly about that. I think he's certainly just as good as any of those guys. I think, if he'd worked at Disney, he could have quite easily been one of the nine old men, easily. Um, or if not one of the nine old men, he certainly could have been at Disney. He certainly could have been a Disney animator. I don't know why he wouldn't have been. I'm glad that he did his own thing, because what that did was that opened up the door for all of us to see all sorts of different other artists' ways of doing things. There's a tendency of thinking, especially with Disney, is that we tended to think of one way with Disney. Like, in order for you to do it, you had to do it this way. It had to be done this way or that way. And that really wasn't true. You really needed to be flexible, you know. So, anyways. Well, anyways, so I say that to talk about my own style, my own way of working. I definitely have learned a lot over the years. I got away from doing animation and primarily got more into directing and doing storyboards and that type of thing. So I've come back, but animation has always been my first love. It was always the thing I liked the most. It's what got me into this business in the first place. So it's definitely a big part of who I am and what I love. So, you know, so it's important. All right, so we got those drawings worked out. How are we doing time-wise? Okay. All right, well, we got these drawings. Kind of basically just went over those scribbles to nail them down a little bit more. All right, well, I think we'll stop here and we'll pick it up tomorrow. But, all right, there you go. So, hey, have a great day. What's left of it is night now. But I will see you guys tomorrow. Have a good one. Good night.